Who could have possibly imagined that the third decade of the 21st century would start like this? By the end of March 2020, most of our planet was in lockdown. The empty streets and closed businesses spoke of the unprecedented change to our otherwise vibrant lifestyle. The draconian measures implemented by governments around the globe triggered an economic meltdown, to which the Great Depression paled in comparison. The livelihoods of millions of people were at stake, which could have potentially led to worldwide famine and social unrest of unimaginable proportions. However, we were told that this was the lesser of two evils. Our political leaders and their medical advisors had determined that only through lockdowns could we prevent COVID-19 from overwhelming medical systems around the world, killing millions of people in the process, and threatening the very foundations of our civilization. Paralyzed with fear, we quickly accepted the implementation of the draconian measures, in hopes of avoiding the horrifying scenario already unfolding in Italy. Amid the chaos and panic, Professor Walter Ricciardi, coordinator for the Italian Scientific Committee for COVID-19, came out with a shocking statement. The way in which we code deaths in our country is very generous, in the sense that all the people who die in hospitals with the coronavirus are deemed to be dying from the coronavirus. On re-evaluation by the National Institute of Health, only 12% of death certificates have shown a direct causality from coronavirus. This statement resulted in a wave of public criticism by numerous medical experts, including Professor Sukert Bhakti, one of the most renowned microbiologists in the world.
This violates a basic principle in medicine. It simply must be established that a patient dies because of, and not simply with, a virus. The simple and trivial presence of the virus must never ever qualify it to enter the register of COVID deaths. Robert Koch opened the door to modern medicine when he demonstrated that a specific disease, tuberculosis, had a specific cause, the bacterium. Scientifically based knowledge has continued to replace belief in medicine. Let us strive to follow the path of progress.
The United States is yet another place where coding death certificates is done in a highly unscientific way.
If someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
If you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means that even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death. I hope that's helpful.
Dr. Scott Jensen joins me now. Doctor, I want to read for our viewers what the CDC says in part about how to count COVID deaths relating to that last issue we just raised. In cases where a definite diagnosis of COVID cannot be made, but is suspected or likely, like the circumstances are compelling with a reasonable degree of certainty, it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. So, doctor, what's the problem with that?
Well, in short, it's ridiculous. I spent some time earlier today just going through the CDC's manual on how to complete death certificates and the parts that were specifically written for physicians. And in that manual, it talks of precision and specificity, and that's what we were trained with. I mean, let's just take someone getting hit by a bus and they collapse along and they go into the emergency room and they're there for 15, 20 minutes. Blood work comes back, COVID test comes back positive, and they die 20 minutes later because of their collapsed lung. We're going to put that down as COVID-19? That doesn't make any sense. The determination of the cause of death is a big deal. It has impact on estate planning. It has impact on future generations. And the idea that we're going to allow people to massage and sort of game the numbers is a real issue because we're going to undermine the trust. And right now, as we see politicians doing things that aren't necessarily motivated on fact and science, the public's their trust in politicians is already wearing thin.
What do you make of the CDC and the WHO guidance to assume COVID-19 when coding deaths?
This is one way to artificially inflate numbers, to give the politicians a bit of to cover their gluteus maximus. I don't see any other reason why you should call something that it isn't on the death certificate.
Or something that you don't know, if you don't know what it is.
You say you don't know.
By mid-April, New York had become the new hotspot for the coronavirus outbreak, hitting a death toll of more than 10,000 people. Unsurprisingly, statistical shenanigans played a major role in achieving this negative milestone. As The Guardian points out, the soaring death toll has been fueled by the adding of 3,778 people, who were not tested for COVID-19, but are presumed to have died from it. Last week, Bill de Blasio, New York City's mayor, admitted that the official death toll was probably too low, as many people who died at home or in nursing homes were not included. By this point, it was apparent that there is a concerted effort to artificially boost the numbers of COVID-19 deaths. This piqued the interest of the investigative journalists from Project Veritas, who released secret recordings of 3 funeral directors, sharing their first-hand experience with the way deaths are coded in New York.
To me, all you're doing is you're padding statistics. You know, you're putting people on that have COVID-19. If they didn't have it, you're making the death rate for New York City a lot higher than it should be.
To be honest with you, all of the death certificates, they're writing COVID on all of the death certificates, whether they had a positive test, whether they didn't. So I think, you know, again, this is my personal opinion. I think like the mayor in our city, they're looking for federal funding, and the more they put COVID on a death certificate, the more they can ask for federal funds. So I think it's political.
I had one that was autopsy because it was furious. And apparently, and I don't know who the Supreme Court Justice is, but the Supreme Court Justice was related to this family. And she says, I know my sister didn't die of COVID-19. She said she had Alzheimer's and they didn't suction her. You have to suction because they forget how to swallow. And right away they put down COVID-19 on her death certificate, and this Supreme Court Justice, whoever it is, contacted the hospital. They did an independent autopsy. Bingo, no COVID-19.
Unsurprisingly, the United Kingdom seems to have adopted the same modus operandi of manipulating COVID-19 statistics. Northern Ireland's Public Health Agency defines a COVID-19 death as individuals who have died within 28 days of first positive result, whether or not COVID-19 was the cause of death. In England and Wales, a death can be attributed to COVID-19 only based on the doctor's suspicion. A positive test result is not required at all. For example, if before death the patient had symptoms typical of COVID-19 infection, but the test result has not been received, it would be satisfactory to give COVID-19 as the cause of death. In the circumstances of there being no swab, it is satisfactory to apply clinical judgment. To make things even worse, the new coronavirus bill specifically states that COVID-19 is no longer considered a notifiable disease. This means that deaths attributed to COVID-19 are completely exempt from jury inquest, even if there are strong suspicions that the novel coronavirus is not the cause of death. In other words, not only does the government actively encourage doctors to specify COVID-19 as the cause of death, even when there is little or no evidence for it, but also, they have intentionally removed the safeguards which were designed to correct these mistakes. Furthermore, in regards to the new coronavirus bill, the Office of the Chief Coroner stated that these deaths don't have to be referred to a coroner at all. Any registered medical practitioner can sign a medical certificate of cause of death, even if the deceased was not attended during their last illness, and not seen after death, provided that they are able to state the cause of death to the best of their knowledge and belief. Similar bizarre policies forbidding or recommending against autopsies have been enacted by numerous governments around the world. Fortunately, there are pathologists who have shared their findings with the public.
Professor Klaus Püschel ist der Leiter der Rechtsmedizin im UKE. Er und sein Kollege obduzieren alle, die in Hamburg an Covid-19 gestorben sind. Seiner Ansicht nach ist die Angst vor dem Virus übertrieben. Covid-19 sei eine vergleichsweise. Sie haben gesagt, das ist jetzt, glaube ich, 10 Tage her, in einem Interview mit einer großen Zeitung, Sie hätten noch keinen einzigen Covid-19-Fall auf Ihrem Seziertisch gehabt, der ausschließlich an Covid-19 ohne eine weitere Vorerkrankung gestorben sei. Stand heute immer noch so?
Ja, immer noch derselbe Stand. Alle Toten, wir haben inzwischen über 100 in dieser Region obduziert, hatten schwere vorbestehende innere Erkrankungen. Die waren zwischen 50 und 100 Jahre alt. Das Durchschnittsalter ist bei 80 Jahren.
Along with the significantly inflated COVID mortality figures, the hospital admission data has also been heavily manipulated. As explained by the Daily Mail, hospitals in New York have disclosed that nearly half of their so-called COVID-19 patients currently hospitalized were admitted for other reasons. Likewise, in England, close to 40% of patients included in the government's daily COVID statistics may have been admitted for something else, such as a broken leg. In South Africa, ground zero of the Omicron outbreak, up to 60% of COVID patients were not admitted primarily for the virus at the height of the crisis there. An even more blatant falsifying of data was admitted by Australian officials from the New South Wales state.
So, for example, if you were 22 years of age, you had COVID 3 weeks ago, you'd recovered from that, fell off your bicycle, broke your arm and came to hospital, we would count you as a COVID admission.
Given all this statistical trickery, it should come as no surprise that the case figure has also been tampered with.
I noticed in your paper you said that in mid-March there was a change in the reporting system. What was that all about?
This is not the first time it happens. On March 20th, Germany changed its reporting system, and suddenly a lot of cases that had not been reported before were reported. But this is not a sudden increase in cases. Overall, this had no impact on the dynamics of the German epidemic. It increased until about March 27th or so, and has been stable or declining since. The problem in this disease is that reporting and diagnosing are not separated and recorded differently. In the AIDS epidemic, every case was reported with a day of diagnosis and a day of reporting. For whatever reason, this standard developed during the AIDS epidemic is not being employed here. So we cannot deconvolute this data.
In addition to this, as the supply of PCR testing kits was increasing, authorities began testing more and more people, which of course resulted in a drastic rise in the number of registered infections. At a certain point, government officials started to erroneously use the terms infection and case interchangeably, even though they don't have the same meaning. In medicine, a viral infection is considered to be the invasion of an organism by a virus. When it comes to acute respiratory diseases, such as COVID-19, the flu or just a simple cold, the vast majority of infections are non-symptomatic, whereas symptomatic infections are much more rare. Historically, with regard to seasonal influenza or the common cold, people with no symptoms, even if infected, have always been considered healthy, while those who have developed symptoms and have gotten sick are the ones who are considered cases of the disease. However, these simple medical principles have been completely disregarded during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so, both symptomatic and non-symptomatic infections are now counted as cases.
The test that we have for the virus does not tell us whether we have an active virus in a person. It's being called by the media a case. It's not a case at all. It's just that we can detect that at some time in the past, perhaps, there has been viral infection, but it's probably been removed now.
A case is when someone gets sick from a disease. That's completely different from a positive test.
In this phase of the pandemic, people have equated positive tests with cases. Now, this isn't correct. This is simply wrong. In the normal winter, we never obsessively test the population for any virus to the extent to which this virus is being tested for. And the fact is, if you have a positive test but you're not unwell, you cannot be regarded as a case of this disease. You're just somebody who's got a virus. The only people who in a normal winter turn up as cases of this disease are people who are admitted to hospital, people who become seriously ill. And they're a very tiny proportion of the number of positive tests that you would do if you tested everybody.
The WHO also agrees that the criteria for diagnosing a case of COVID-19 should include not only a positive PCR test, but also clinical observations of the patient's symptoms, among other things. Most PCR assays are indicated as an aid for diagnosis. Therefore, healthcare providers must consider any result in combination with timing of sampling, specimen type, assay specifics, clinical observations, patient history, confirmed status of any contacts, and epidemiological information. Ignoring these scientific basics, authorities around the world have relied solely on PCR tests to diagnose COVID-19, quarantining countless numbers of healthy non-symptomatic people who just tested positive for the virus. What makes this even worse is that there are fundamental problems with the polymerase chain reaction test. At its core, this diagnostic method does not even test for the virus itself. Instead, it is designed to amplify a DNA fragment numerous times, until the fragment is large enough to be identified as part of the genetic sequence of the virus. The higher the number of cycles required to detect the targeted viral DNA, the less likely it is that the person is infected with the virus. A very well-researched article in the New York Times explores this topic in further detail. This number of amplification cycles needed to find the virus, called the cycle threshold, is never included in the results sent to doctors and coronavirus patients, although it could tell them how infectious the patients are. In 3 sets of testing data that include cycle thresholds, compiled by officials in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, up to 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus, a review by the Times found. On Thursday, the United States recorded 45,604 new coronavirus cases, according to a database maintained by the Times. If the rates of contagiousness in Massachusetts and New York were to apply nationwide, then perhaps only 4,500 of those people may actually need to isolate and submit to contact tracing. One solution would be to adjust the cycle threshold used now to decide that a patient is infected. Most tests set the limit at 40, a few at 37. This means that you are positive for the coronavirus, if the test process required up to 40 cycles or 37 to detect the virus. Tests with thresholds so high may detect not just live virus, but also genetic fragments, leftovers from infection that pose no particular risk, akin to finding a hair in a room long after a person has left, Dr. Mina said. Any test with a cycle threshold above 35 is too sensitive, agreed Juliet Morrison, a virologist at the University of California, Riverside. I'm shocked that people would think that 40 could represent a positive, she said. A more reasonable cutoff would be 30 to 35, she added. Dr. Mina said he would set the figure at 30 or even less. Those changes would mean the amount of genetic material in a patient's sample would have to be 100-fold to 1,000-fold that of the current standard for the test to return a positive result, at least one worth acting on. The CDC's own calculations suggest that it is extremely difficult to detect any live virus in a sample above a threshold of 33 cycles. In Massachusetts, from 85 to 90% of people who tested positive in July with a cycle threshold of 40 would have been deemed negative if the threshold were 30 cycles, Dr. Mina said. I would say that none of those people should be contact traced, not one. The number of people with positive results who are not infectious is particularly concerning, said Scott Becker, Executive Director of the Association of Public Health Laboratories. Another expert who is also aware of the unreliability of PCR tests is none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci, the leading COVID-19 advisor to the United States government.
If you get a cycle threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. But you almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle.
Further proof of the shortcomings of PCR tests comes from a couple of court cases around Europe. In Portugal and Austria, judges have ruled that the PCR test for COVID-19 is an unreliable and insufficient diagnostic tool, and should not justify the isolation of individuals who have tested positive. The debate over the accuracy of the polymerase chain reaction test is nothing new in the world of science. Ever since Kary Mullis invented the method in 1993, and received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for it. He has adamantly insisted that the PCR test is most useful in biomedical research and criminal forensics, and has extremely limited potential for diagnosing viral sickness.
And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that.
In addition to this, the manufacturers of PCR test kits for SARS-CoV-2 have specified that their products should be used only for research purposes, not for diagnostic procedures. The reason for this is that these PCR test kits have not undergone the standard trials required to prove their efficacy in detecting the virus. Instead, the Federal Drug Administration has allowed these products to be put on the market by giving them emergency use authorization, asserting that there is no time for rigorous quality control procedures due to urgent pandemic circumstances. When we put all the pieces of the puzzle together, we come to a very crucial realization. The case statistics are based on completely unproven PCR tests, which are giving an incredibly high percentage of false positives, which in turn are mislabeled as cases. This of course results in highly exaggerated case and death figures, which are the main driving forces behind the draconian lockdown policies. Unsurprisingly, the mainstream media has done very little to inform the public about these key issues. In fact, popular news outlets have been at the forefront of spreading false information on COVID-19. A secret footage released by Project Veritas reveals that CBS News had published a fake news report on the coronavirus. It turns out that medical staff members from Cherry Health Clinic were posing as patients lining up for a COVID-19 test.
Apparently, the news crew wanted more people in the line because they knew it was scheduled.
Yeah, so we're just looking for volunteers to go out and just drive through the tent. Yeah, that's just to make it look busy for the meals because they were right there.
Well, we knew they were coming. We had no clue that we were going to have to do fake patients.
I didn't see you guys do the swab at all. I just saw you talking with them. And then I was talking with the other girl.
There were a couple real patients, which made it worse.
The scandal blew up like wildfire, and CBS immediately removed the news report from their website. This begs the question, how can we possibly trust similar reports of hospitals being overwhelmed with patients? Many physicians have come forward, telling a much different story.
The hospital released some data today. In the hospital today, there is 14 cases of COVID out of 900,000 people. And there's 3 people on ventilators per their public data. So when you talk about an overwhelming COVID illness, in Kern County, we do not have that.
A similar situation has been observed all across the United States. According to the American Hospital Association, in the first half of 2020, there have been 19.5% fewer inpatients and 34.5% fewer outpatients compared to previous years. There are several factors that are responsible for this shocking statistics. On one hand, many hospitals canceled scheduled doctor's appointments, diagnostic procedures, and even operations, in order to have enough capacity for the expected massive surge of coronavirus patients. However, these expectations never materialized in most clinics. On the other hand, people with other illnesses were too afraid of catching SARS-CoV-2, and so, they avoided going to the hospital at all costs. Despite all this, politicians kept on insisting that even more beds are needed for the inevitable incoming tsunami of COVID-19 patients. Stadiums, sports arenas, hotels and other large buildings were repurposed into field hospitals, but remained largely empty for months on end. The U.S. naval ship called Comfort, with about 1,000 beds, and 1,200 member crew, was docked at the New York coast for about a month. But in the end, only 182 patients received care on board the vessel. Likewise, the naval ship called Mercy stayed at the California coast for more than 7 weeks, during which, a mere 77 people were treated there. A similar scenario has unfolded in the United Kingdom and many other countries. The staggering discrepancy between the fact that hospitals have largely remained unused during the pandemic, and the news reports of medical systems being overwhelmed, raised a lot of suspicions among people. As a result, #FilmYourHospital started to trend on Twitter, with countless videos revealing that indeed most medical facilities have very few patients in them. Meanwhile, doctors and nurses from all across the globe were bored to death, and decided to show the world their hidden dancing talents. Would medical personnel be doing this, if humanity was indeed in the middle of one of the deadliest pandemics in known history? Would they find time and energy to dance and twerk, if they were desperately fighting for the lives of unprecedented number of terribly ill patients, when every second could mean the difference between life and death? If people were dropping like flies, one might think it wouldn't be so easy to be in such a great mood. Given all the lies about the medical systems being on the brink of breakdown, how could we possibly trust similar reports of morgues and cemeteries being overflown with dead bodies, necessitating the digging of mass graves? How many people died not because of COVID, but rather because they were unable to get access to proper medical care on time? And, just as importantly, how many people were killed by the actual treatment of their COVID illness? The German doctor of internal medicine, Dr. Klaus Kionlein, explains how a case study published in the medical journal Lancet reveals the dangers of these new treatment protocols.
Von einem 50-jährigen Patienten, der an Corona erkrankt ist. Bei dem Patienten ging das los mit Husten, Schüttelfrost, Fieber, Erschöpfung und Shortness of Breath, also schlecht Luft.
Atemnot, ja.
Und die Behandlung erfolgte mit Hochdosis Methylprednisolon, also Hochdosis Cortison. 600 Milligramm Cortison sind das. Moxifloxacin, das ist ein sehr hartes Antibiotikum aus der Gruppe der Gerasehämmer. Zusätzlich noch Liponavir und Ritonavir, das sind beides Nukleosidanaloga und Proteasehämmer aus der AIDS-Therapie. Ziemlich toxische Sachen. Und das Ganze noch mit Interferon versehen, das auch ein Virostatikum bzw. Immunsuppressivum ist. Das hat auch immunsuppressive Effekte und dann zum Schluss noch mal ein Breitbandantibiotikum darüber geschüttet und das führte dann dazu, dass der Patient gestorben ist. Ein 50-jähriger Patient.
Also nicht die Risikogruppe, keineswegs.
Nee.
Das heißt, diese Behandlung hat jetzt das Immunsystem von diesem Mann
aus meiner Sicht ist diese Behandlung ein Kunstfehler und hat den Patienten umgebracht.
Warum hat man das gemacht?
Aus Angst wahrscheinlich. Weil er Luftnot hatte, hat man ihm Cortison gegeben. Nach Cortison geht es einem erstmal besser, weil die Entzündungsantwort ausgebremst wird. Das ist ein Lymphozytenkiller, Cortison. Da schwillt alles ab, die Lymphozyten werden vernichtet. Das ist aber gleichzeitig die Abwehrreaktion, die man damit unterbindet. Das Fieber geht runter, dem Patienten geht es vorübergehend besser. Er kriegt ein bisschen besser Luft, aber es kann dann letal ausgehen, wie in diesem Fall zu sehen.
Heißt das, dass das jetzt so das Muster ist, wonach man in Italien behandelt?
Ich fürchte das. Ich bin nun nicht da in Italien und kann auch nicht die Krankenakten einsehen. Aber wenn sowas im Lancet steht...
Als ein Paradebeispiel, oder?
Als Paradebeispiel, auch wenn es ungünstig ausgegangen ist, vermute ich, dass die Ärzte nach genau so einem Schema dort unten auch vorgehen. Und das ist die eigentliche Gefahr, die jetzt droht, dass die Ärzte nach diesem Schema oder nach solchen Schemata vorgehen und die Leute durch die Therapie sozusagen dadurch eine höhere Letalität erzeugen und sofort wirkt das Ganze wesentlich bedrohlicher. Auch was die rechtliche Seite angeht, sie sind immer auf der sichereren Seite. Wenn sie alles machen und der Patient hinterher stirbt, haben sie keinen Fehler gemacht. Während wenn sie nichts gemacht haben, der Patient stirbt hinterher, dann haben sie ein Problem.
With every passing month, the standard treatment protocol for COVID-19 evolved, and a new drug, called remdesivir, became a key part of it. The product was developed by Gilead Sciences for the treatment of hepatitis C, and later it was investigated as a potential cure for Ebola. In that study, which was conducted in 2019, the group of subjects given remdesivir had the highest death rate, compared to the other three groups which received different therapeutics. Because of its poor performance and potential risk for the subjects, remdesivir was removed from the trial. Months later, scientists began testing its safety and efficacy in COVID-19 patients. 2 studies published in the Lancet Medical Journal determined that remdesivir use was not associated with a difference in time to clinical improvement, and that no clinical benefit was observed from the use of remdesivir in patients who were admitted to hospital for COVID-19. Even the WHO announced that they recommend against the use of remdesivir, after their own clinical trial showed that the drug was ineffective. Furthermore, plenty of scientific publications have documented the negative safety profile of remdesivir. In France, 4 out of 5 subjects who were given the drug had to stop taking it. 2 of them, because of severely elevated liver enzyme, 3 to 5 times the normal range, indicating liver toxicity, and the other 2, because of renal failure, requiring a kidney replacement. Moreover, a different group of researchers analyzed the World Health Organization's global database, which contains reports of potential side effects of medicinal products. They found that remdesivir administration resulted in 20 times more reports of acute renal failure, compared to the administration of other drugs given to COVID-19 patients who were equally sick. These findings were later corroborated by another team of scientists, who stated in their paper that kidney disorders, almost exclusively acute kidney injury, represent a serious, early, and potentially fatal adverse drug reaction of remdesivir. And last but not least, remdesivir is known to cause severe toxicity to the cardiovascular system. Unsurprisingly, medical professionals have tried to warn the public of the grave dangers of this product.
And they rolled out remdesivir onto a substantial number of patients for which we all saw it was killing the patients. And now it's the FDA-approved drug that is continuing to kill patients in the United States.
As we're driving to the hospital, I told him, I'm very worried about you. And he said, well, I know not to go on COVID protocols. I know not to take remdesivir. I know not to do a ventilator. The very next day that he was in the hospital, he woke up with the IV in his arm. And I knew that kidneys shutting down from being given remdesivir is pretty common. Called the hospital and I got a different nurse on the phone and said, oh yes, he was given remdesivir as soon as he came in. Roughly 9 days later, his kidneys were at 6% function. He was vented full-time dialysis. And the doctor told me that Ryan was a full code. So he said that he would do CPR if I wanted to. But he told me that it would only prolong Ryan's death and not prolong his life. That Ryan was really gone.
It almost beggars belief that such an immensely dangerous product would be the staple treatment choice in hospitals. And we have to ask ourselves, how did medical authorities give the green light to this drug in the first place? As a start, the main study, which allegedly proved the efficacy of remdesivir, was conducted by a group of scientists, 7 of which had financial ties to Gilead Sciences, the manufacturer of the drug. Needless to say, the positive outcome was achieved only after a carefully crafted scientific sleight of hand.
Even look at the remdesivir study published in New England Journal. We know that they committed scientific misconduct. In that remdesivir study, you may not know this. No. They changed the endpoint. What they did, Tony Fauci didn't say this in the White House, they unblinded the study halfway. It was not going to reach the predetermined endpoints. The endpoints were death and intubation and being on a ventilator. They realized the study would fail. So what did they do? They changed the endpoint to some nebulous endpoint of time to recovery. And since they knew which patients were unblinded, they discharged them early. It's a fabricated, fraudulent study.
In addition to this, the scientific panel which provides the coronavirus treatment guidelines to doctors all across the United States also involves experts connected to Gilead Sciences. Sadly, apart from the highly toxic cocktail of drugs such as remdesivir, the coronavirus treatment protocol also includes another potentially deadly therapy. Many physicians have decided to stop using the mechanical ventilation machines because of the unusually high number of deaths caused by them. Surprisingly, the dangers of this medical breathing apparatus have been known for years. In a nutshell, when the tube is inserted into a person's airway, it can potentially allow germs to travel directly into the lungs, causing ventilator-associated pneumonia. According to Medscape.com, the disease is reported to occur in 8 to 28% of patients who are given mechanical ventilation, and has a mortality rate of 33 to 50%. Moreover, it appears that the intubation protocols for COVID-19 patients use a much higher than usual ventilatory pressures, volumes, and flow rates, which irreversibly destroys the lung tissue, and further increases the lethality of the treatment. Shocking reports of the deadly use of mechanical ventilation have come out from Erin Marie Olszewski, a highly respected medical nurse, who decided to make secret recordings while she worked at Elmhurst Hospital in New York.
Obviously, Elmhurst Hospital in Queens is right now the epicenter within the epicenter.
Elmhurst Hospital is the epicenter of the
What is the likelihood of coming out of the hospital you're in?
The only person that survived, ironically, is a guy who pulled his own tube out. Yeah.
So he woke up enough to be able to do that?
Yeah, he wanted it out. He should have never been on in the first place. That's a whole nother story.
But he pulled his tube out, and so he has a chance again.
Oh, he did?
He extubated himself.
Oh, he did? I didn't know that. I thought he was extubated.
Had he not pulled that out, he would definitely be dead. For sure. They don't extubate anyone.
Here's the problem. Not a single patient here, since this thing began, has been discharged or successfully extubated.
It's blowing people's lungs out. They're so sedated. He had probably 8 or 9 drips. It's all sedation. It's all sedation and paralytics. So you are asleep. It is essentially like you're under, you're in surgery, when they put you under like that for a good month straight. There's no way you can recover from something like that. You'll be brain dead if you do.
Another key insight into the COVID-19 protocols comes from 2 lawyers whose clients are suing clinics for the death of their loved ones.
So tell me then go ahead, because you have so many clients involved in this. Is there a commonality to the story, and what does that sound like?
There's a tremendous commonality.
Since the press conference, I think we've received thousands of emails and phone calls from across the country. In 32 states was the last count we had. I'm blown away by the similarities. There's no exaggeration in here. We have pictures of patients with their hands strapped to the beds with bruising and all sorts of discoloration through their hands. It's incredible.
Their phone is put across the room. They can't call anybody. They can't ask for help. Oftentimes, the button for calling for a nurse is removed. They're in this room. They're isolated from their family. They're zip tied down. The oxygen is being shoved into them. And then sometimes a psychiatrist will come in and say, well, you look agitated. Let's get you on a morphine drip. And then they can't fight the effects of the remdesivir, which is doing something to their kidneys. Their lungs are filling up with fluid. They're getting all kinds of drugs. I mean, we have clients, and I know of folks who have received 30, 40 plus drugs, many of them contraindicated for use with remdesivir.
Unbelievable.
They're not given food or water of any kind, not through an IV, of no kind. Average time to death is about 9 days.
As nurses, we are getting reports across the country from our American frontline nurses about patients not getting food, patients not getting water. How come a patient hasn't been fed in 9 days? Why do I need to get a court order to force a hospital to feed a person who isn't intubated and who's literally telling you they would like food? Oh, well, you can't take your BiPAP mask off. Well, that's what us nurses are for. We're going to help you take that off, and we're going to help you eat, but we're not allowed to. If they're on a ventilator, they're not getting basic standards of care. I've had patients that haven't been bathed, haven't been fed, haven't been given water, haven't been turned. And if you ask me, this isn't a hospital, this is a concentration camp. That's right. Absolutely it is.
And there's a lot of nurses that know that this is wrong, but they're afraid to say anything publicly.
My bigger problem with this whole scenario is when they intubate people who don't need it.
Yeah.
And it looks very clear to me that they're just pushing it. Where's it coming from? What's the purpose? Are you guys really trying to kill everybody like everybody thinks?
Following orders has led to the sheer number of deaths that has occurred in these hospitals. I didn't see a single patient died of COVID. I've seen a substantial number of patients die of negligence and medical malfeasance.
What's even worse is that authorities actively encourage and enable such atrocities by heavily rewarding each hospital at every step of the process, from the moment a patient enters the clinic to the moment they exit in a body bag.
So you're saying they're putting non-COVID or COVID rule out with definite COVID patients?
Yes.
This is going to be the only COVID, so they shouldn't put any non-COVIDs here. Well, that's what they've been doing.
They're banking on the fact that they'll get it because they're already immunocompromised. So and they'll put them in the same room, so there's double rooms. So you have a COVID with a non-COVID. They don't even care.
What makes you think they really want them to get COVID? Because
money. Money.
If they become a complex patient and all that's required is you either intubate them or you put them in the ICU, or you say they're in the ICU, maybe they're just in a room. At that point, they're a complex patient. Average charge rate is $454,000 and change. On top of that, our government has incentivized the use of remdesivir to the exclusion of other remedies. If you don't offer ivermectin, you don't offer hydroxychloroquine, you just offer remdesivir. Now you get a code, and you get a 20% bump on the entire hospital stay. That's another $90,000 on 450, roughly. I'm just using round numbers here. So I hope your mathematicians in the audience don't get too hard on me. But
you're over $500,000 incentives to a hospital system. Yeah. They're being told to shut down all their other departments. There's no oncology anymore. There's no heart, doctors in the building. All of your money is going to have to come during COVID from COVID. Well, look, this is just one of the hospital systems that's this is the stock tracking. Look at the S&P 500. Look, it tracks. The green there is this HCA. That's a hospital group that does very well. It kind of goes right along with the index. But look, right in there around May and then July, you start handing them giant funding. Look what happens to their stock. They stop treating cancer. They stop treating heart disease. No money coming in from anything else except the government paying you to kill people with remdesivir and ventilators. And now you're more profitable than you've ever been. That is absolutely shocking, and it's deplorable, and I don't think it's going to age well in our history books.
While many hospitals were killing patients for profit, clinicians from all corners of the planet were successfully treating COVID-19 using hydroxychloroquine, a decades-old proven malaria medication, which is known for its strong antiviral properties, and is a staple in the World Health Organization's essential medicines list.
In your home state where you were treating people, what would the protocol be?
Our hospital would just treat them based on the individuals, and they were using the hydroxychloroquine and the zinc and, that protocol, for sure.
At your hospital?
Oh, yeah.
And that seemed to work?
Yeah. We didn't have anybody that died.
Only on 2 tonight, a Houston hospital is having success treating the coronavirus patients. In fact, its recovery rate is perfect.
Fascinating, isn't it? To treat patients here, Dr. Veron is using an experimental drug protocol. It's a cocktail of vitamins, steroids, and blood thinners. Each patient also is getting hydroxychloroquine, the malaria drug touted by President Trump. The protocol is controversial because there hasn't been time for extensive testing, but Dr. Veron says it works.
We've treated over 40 plus patients with this treatment, and we haven't had a single complication.
So far, he says, none of his patients have died.
This is working. And if it's working, I'm going to keep on doing it.
What we're finding clinically with our patients is that it really only works in conjunction with zinc. So the hydroxychloroquine opens the zinc channel, zinc goes into the cell, it then blocks the replication of the cellular machinery.
You're prescribing it, and it is working for COVID-19 patients.
Every patient I've prescribed it to has been very, very ill, and within 8 to 12 hours, they were basically symptom-free. And so clinically, I am seeing a resolution. That mirrors what we saw in the French study and some of the other studies worldwide. But what I am seeing is that people are taking it alone by itself, it's not having efficacy.
As the evidence supporting the use of HCQ piled up, doctors around the world started to demand that the drug becomes more readily accessible for COVID-19 treatment. In France, for example, this grassroots initiative culminated in a petition signed by hundreds of thousands of people, including thousands of physicians. In August 2020, hydroxychloroquine in combination with several other medications formed the basis of a multifaceted protocol created by a team of expert physicians, led by the world-renowned Dr. Peter McCullough.
We worked with a practice north of us in Dallas, in the Plano-Frisco area, that did this protocol in hundreds of patients. They demonstrated an 85% reduction in hospitalization and death, as well as another practice led by legendary Dr. Vladimir Zelenko in Monroe, New York, that showed the exact same thing. Others have come on. There's been an analysis by Paul Alexander, published in Medical Hypotheses, in the nursing home. We found that almost anything done in the nursing home, different components of these protocols, dropped mortality by 60%. So this has been a story of American heroes. It's been a story of worldwide success. In the UK, the Bird Group is doing the same thing. In Italy, the Treatment Domiciliary COVID-19 group, they've actually had rallies in the piazzas of Italy declaring 0 hospitalizations with this multi-drug approach. We have PANDA in South Africa, the COVID Medical Network in Australia. This entire effort received no support from any government in the entire world. We had hero doctors that really had to break with the academic ivory tower. We didn't have a single academic institution come up with a single protocol. They didn't even try. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Duke, you name it. Not a single medical center set up even a tent to try to treat patients and prevent hospitalization and death. There wasn't an ounce of original research.
To make things even worse, from the moment HCQ began showing promising results, the medical establishment embarked on a relentless war against it, with a series of poorly designed studies in which the drug was doomed to fail. First, at the beginning of April, a team of Brazilian researchers conducted a study, which was designed to test the effectiveness of the drug against late-stage COVID-19 illness. The trial was stopped after the death of 11 patients, and hydroxychloroquine was immediately blamed for the disastrous results. However, upon closer inspection, numerous experts, including Professor Peter Kremsner from the University of Tübingen in Germany, condemned the authors of the study for administering doses that were dangerous and definitely too high, several times more than what's normally prescribed. Besides, the participants were given a less safe version of the drug, chloroquine diphosphate, further increasing the chances of a lethal outcome, especially in light of the fact that the subjects were already suffering with a severe case of COVID-19. As a result of this fiasco, the 27 researchers involved in the study are currently under criminal investigation by the Brazilian government. But this is not all. 2 more studies were initiated in an attempt to test the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine on late-stage COVID-19 patients. The first one, called Solidarity, was started by the World Health Organization. The other one, called Recovery, was carried out by the UK government. Strangely enough, both of these trials repeated many of the mistakes made in the Brazilian study. First of all, the chosen participants were suffering with late-stage COVID-19, even though previous studies had established that HCQ is mostly effective when given at the early stages of the disease. Secondly, the researchers used extremely high doses of the drug, which not only could diminish any potential benefit from it, but also contribute to lethal outcomes. Once again, medical experts from around the world were perplexed by the terrible misuse of this proven drug. This prompted the Indian Council of Medical Research to write a letter to the World Health Organization, pointing out the obvious flaws in the Solidarity study. As reported by the New Indian Express, a health ministry official explained. Internationally, in Solidarity trial, COVID-19 patients are being administered with 800 mg, 2 loading doses 6 hours apart, followed by 400 mg, 2 doses per day for 10 days. The total dosage given to a patient over 11 days is about 9,600 mg, which is 4 times higher than the dose we are giving to our patients, informed the official. This indicates that in our treatment protocol the efficacy of HCQ is good, and patients are recovering quickly with less amount of dosage being administered, said the official. Counter to all logic, the WHO and UK government disregarded the criticism, and continued using extremely high doses of HCQ in late-stage coronavirus patients. As a result of this decision, the trials concluded that the drug is not effective against the novel coronavirus. But this is not the full extent of the war against HCQ. On May 22, the renowned medical journal Lancet published a study, which found that COVID-19 patients treated with HCQ had a higher risk of dying. Within days, various European governments began banning hydroxychloroquine. In a shocking turn of events, only 6 days after the Lancet study was published, about 200 scientists signed an open letter, demanding that the paper is investigated for fraud.
Well, Lancet published this paper. Anybody looked at it in 2 seconds knew it didn't make sense. It looked like a fake paper, and which I can tell you, I'm the editor of 2 major journals. I did editorial work this morning. I've done this for 20 years. I am telling you, as an editor, a fraudulent paper would never get past my eyes as an editor. Never. We have an editor, associate editors. We have 2 or more reviewers. We have a very tight processing to make sure the data are correct.
Il trouve qu'il y a exactement la même moyenne âge, qu'il y a exactement le même sexe ratio, et je pense que c'est techniquement strictement impossible. Donc, a priori, sauf à ce que ça devienne un article normal, c'est-à-dire un article pour lequel on peut reproduire les données en ayant accès aux données, donc il n'y a aucun accès aux données.
To make things even worse, the lead author, Dr. Mandeep Mekra, was found to be in conflict of interest with HCQ's rival drug, remdesivir. For all these reasons, The Lancet retracted the paper 2 weeks after its publication, in what can be described as one of the most shameful scientific frauds in modern history. Despite these shocking revelations, the smear campaign against HCQ had already accomplished its goal. Large portions of the public have become fearful of this inexpensive and highly effective drug, and its use in the treatment of COVID-19 remains very limited. Besides, numerous doctors who have dared to speak out in favor of these effective and safe treatments have become victims of the iron fist of the system. From being relentlessly ridiculed and getting fired from their job, to facing legal problems and even receiving death threats.
We saw in Australia early in April, they put on the books in one of the provinces in Australia a law that said if a doctor tried to use hydroxychloroquine, that doctor could be punished, including imprisonment.
The oppressive tactics employed by governments against medical professionals prompted over 17,000 doctors and scientists to sign the Rome Declaration, which states, thousands of physicians are being prevented from providing treatment to their patients, as a result of barriers put up by pharmacies, hospitals, and public health agencies, rendering the vast majority of healthcare providers helpless to protect their patients in the face of disease. Physicians are now advising their patients to simply go home, allowing the virus to replicate, and return when their disease worsens, resulting in hundreds of thousands of unnecessary patient deaths, due to failure to treat. This is not medicine. This is not care. These policies may actually constitute crimes against humanity. This of course brings us to several inescapable questions. What is the motive for governments to falsify coronavirus data, and incentivize hospitals to kill patients, while actively clamping down on any COVID-19 treatment other than a vaccine? Who benefits from this madness, and what is the end goal? These are without a doubt the most crucial questions that need to be answered. That's why we have to roll back the tape and examine each of the fallen dominoes one by one. Only then can we get a full grasp of the true nature of this terrible crisis.